yeah, I'm very, very forward to the next presentation, Stephen Lofts, who is also guest and organizer of this event. So Steve, you have the floor.
Yeah.
You have the floor, yes.
Okay. Something different now. The talk's called A Constellation, Miki. So it's to unravel all the thinkers I think are working in making up what we call Miki philosophy or whatever, Miki's world. I trying to not talk about influence, just the English language and habit. Occasionally make you say, well, you know, Lizzie takes it from there. I'm not really interested in that. The reason a constellation are all stars. The difference between a star and a planet is a planet doesn't have its own light source, right? And planets revolve around stars. And so we have a tendency to read the minor figures as planets and not stars. And I think they're all stars. I think this goes with Miki's own idea of genius. That genius is every single person's genius. Genius, like it's not like a Heidegger or a Hegel where there's, or even a Derrida where there is only one sort of great genius and the rest of us are just plebes. So this is definitely an interpretation. Second, I want to say, just to contextualize what I'm going to do, is this is part of a larger project in which I am dealing. It's sort of tentatively titled Kasir and Kyoto School, Philosophy of Culture. So I'm trying to develop a philosophy of culture, which I've worked on in Kasir, but now I'm working on the philosophy of culture that I can find in the Kyoto School. And so I'm trying to extract it. So I've done philosophy of culture of Nishida, which I gave a couple of weeks ago. I gave another talk on the philosophy of culture of Nishitani. And somebody has pushed me to go further in that thing. And as I was doing it, I'm preparing for this, I started to see some similarities. And so one of the things I want to do here is unravel some of Miki's thought and show how it's connected to Kasir, Nakai, but also Nishitani, or how Nishitani's thought is connected to Miki's. So a tentative sort of subtitle would be Nishitani and Miki, a conversation in quotation marks, question mark. Is there a conversation going on here? Did it happen? Could it happen? Etc. In his last text, Kuto Soku in 1982, Nishida speaks paradoxically of the emptiness within the sensible world. That is to say, a form, quote, form image of emptiness. And he uses that same term that Miki uses in that term, and he doesn't use it a lot in other places. For Nishitani, everything is a form image and nothing more, end quote. The thing itself appears by being reflected in utsutsu and transferred to utsutsu, emptiness in the world of sentiment, that is to say, pathos, end quote. In his last work, Nishitani turns to this idea of a fundamental imagination. And to the project of imagining emptiness. And this imagining emptiness would make being transparent. Now, Nishitani provides here and elsewhere an interpretation of Aristotle's concept of common sense. But the question is, how will you integrate Aristotle's idea of common sense with the idea of Buddhist emptiness? There is a great tension in that project. So why does Nishitani turn to this fundamental imagination at the end of his life? And as I was I didn't realize that this was an issue when I gave my paper a couple of weeks ago, and apparently I've discovered it. It is the process by which Nishitani returns to the problem of the imagination remains, quote, a missing link in the study of Nishida's philosophical development. And I would argue that it's been there the whole time, and I'm going to try to explain why I think he does this. So Nishitani's constellation is made up of course, Heidegger, Nishida, and Buddhism. Dogen in particular. But of course, I also would argue that it's also made up of Kassir and Miki. Now, Kassir, and I'm going to focus just on his works on myth because that's the ones that were central here. When Kassir goes to deal with myth, he deals with it in the form of the concept of the mythical thinking. 1922 is his first major try at this. Then language and myth, the contribution to the problem of the names of the gods, 1924. And then the second volume of the philosophy of symbolic forms, 1925. 1925 is a very important year in the development of Heidegger's own thought. When Kassir turns to treat myth, he right off the bat acknowledges that this will have to require transcendental philosophy to be transformed, that transcendental philosophy cannot deal with the problem of myth because the myth can't be a factum of experience that transcendental philosophy usually deals with. So right there, Kassir already flags that he realizes that he's either pushing transcendental philosophy to its very limit, or in fact, he's left that altogether and doing something else. Kassir's work on myth is important for Heidegger. If you look at the seminars in this period, you'll find numerous references to Kassir. Heidegger, in the moment, 1925, stops and does a very thorough book review or critical review of this book. You also find it in Being Time. Quote, the repetition, that average everydayness. So he's speaking about average everydayness. Average everydayness is the repetition and ontologically more transparent purification of what has ontologically been discovered in the philosophical interpretations by Kassir, end quote. However, for Heidegger, Kassir's, quote, interpretation of the essence of Dasein as a possibility of human Dasein, the essence of myth as a possibility of human Dasein remains random and directionless as long as it hasn't been grounded in a radical ontology of Dasein in light of the problem of being in general. The next person we find who's read a lot of Kassir in the Kyoto school would be Nakai. And I'm going to argue that Nakai has actually been very important in the development of Miki's thought and maybe even Nishida's. But I'll focus only on Miki today. Miki, of course, also has read Kassir quite clearly. And in The Logic of Imagination, he says something similar to Heidegger, in that myths of primitive Daseins are not particularly our concern. Let us first examine the theory in order to obtain some suggestions. So his interest in myth is primarily to extrapolate something else. Nishida also read Kassir. He read Substance and Function and a variety of other works, that's clear. And Ralph Elberfeld has suggested that, in fact, Nishida's concept of expression is in part probably developed from his reading of Kassir and Leibniz. Quoting the second volume of the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, which is the volume 1925 volume on myth. As for Nishitani, Nishitani first mentions Kassir in Schelling's Philosophy and Will. I think that was his PhD thesis, in which he does engage in, and oddly enough, in the context of the imagination. And I'm not going to comment on that because it would take us into a long way away. In 1956, he explicitly also returns to Kassir in a text called The Problem of Myth, in which he is essentially arguing that it is science's break or negation of myth that is the cause of nihilism. Nihilism is the result of a fracturing of culture where science has negated our relationship to myth. And so what we have to do in order to overcome nihilism is what he calls a recollection of myth. We have to return and recollect this. And so what is this? And throughout the text, it is clearly Kassir's account of myth that he's working with. Although read, I think. in emptiness and immediacy, or the kuto soku, however you want to translate that, it's untranslatable, I think. In 1982, a fine reading of this shows two things. One, that he's returning to myth and defining religion in terms of this recollection of myth and in terms of the fundamental imagination. But he's also a Kassir connoisseur would go, okay, I can still see all the Kassir. There's still veiled references and use to Kassir. And I've found other references, implicit references or Kassirian language taken up in other places in Nishitani. In Nishitani's biography of Nishida, he speaks about, and very fondly, I think, about his relationship with Miki, about, when Miki comes back from Germany and sort of the aura of this man's come back with, he's been with Heidegger and stuff. And then, of course, the fallout with Nishida, and then, of course, he mentions the Miki's Marxism. And clearly, Nishitani had nothing to do with Marxism, disclaimed it quite a bit. But I think Miki, the human being, he liked very much. And I think the humanism that Miki was trying to make Marxism into would have found somewhat of a sympathetic ear with Nishitani. Much of my work on Kassir and Heidegger before I came to the Kyoto School was trying to reconcile them, to bring them together. And every time I did this at a conference, I was told that square circles don't exist, and you cannot synthesize or reconcile transcendental philosophy and existential philosophy. It's just not possible. And yet, that's exactly what Kyoto School does. That is the project, explicitly explained by Nishida himself, but then I think also by Nishitani and others. So a transcendental philosophy of culture deals with the factum of culture, and it tries to give the logical analysis of the different symbolic forms or different structures that are going to be universal to every culture. So wherever you find culture, you're going to find language. What's the logic of language? What's that logic of sense, the story horizon that works there? And how do you do that while making sure that every particular language would function in that? And if you want to give that up and say that's impossible, then we can't ever recognize in the culturally other the humanity we share with them. We have to start talking about only Japanese culture in this moment, and you can't compare it to anything else, not even Japanese culture 50 years ago or 20 minutes ago. So Kassir and Natwerp is another figure that has been overlooked, and I think in the studies of the Kyoto School, Nishida clearly read Natwerp and I think was influenced them. They take the same project, they go different ways. Natwerp goes down into poeses, into the subjective, and Kassir says, no, I'm not going to go down there because I'm going to end up in metaphysical questions and mysticism, and that's not for me. And so he goes up the ladder, but he always makes clear that these two levels of the ladder are interconnected. The question then becomes whether Kassir and Natwerp are still neo-Kantians. So in the Kyoto School literature, everyone's like, oh, neo-Kantianism, boo-boo, we don't like that. Critique it, okay, fine. But there's neo-Kantians and there's neo-Kantians. There's many schools and there's very different people. And that's just a blanket thing. It's sort of like talking about Japanese philosophy. I mean, it doesn't make much sense. So in Kassir literature and Natwerp literature, the $64 question, and it's hotly debated, is Kassir and Natwerp still neo-Kantians? I'm of the opinion that Kassir started out as a neo-Kantian, pushed transcendental philosophy way beyond anything it could be classical neo-Kantianism. They certainly have moved beyond what's called Cohen's official scientism, where culture is simply an expression of human reason. And so you have science, ethics, and art and religion. And so you can sort of see those as three critiques of Kant that have just been brought into culture by Cohen. But they have gone way beyond that. And I think the later Natwerp and certainly the later Kassir cannot be. The second Kassir starts talking about myth. He recognizes he's moved on, and this was a source of tension between, in fact, him and Cohen. The existential philosophy existential phenomenology can only deal with facticity. It cannot deal with the factum. It cannot deal with structures of meaning that allow us to understand the facticity. And that becomes Cassir's basic critique. That Heidegger has no access to the realm of transpersonal meaning, which would allow him to have a project like phenomenology, that would allow Dasein to have access to the world or even to itself. There's no way from one Dasein to another except through this world of form. So Cassir's approach to Heidegger is not to say, oh, you got it all wrong. What he says is, that's really good, very interesting, I love this. But your project goes right through mine. If you read Heidegger closely enough, you see Heidegger is saying, you got nothing wrong. In fact, everything you say here is correct. There's a quote in his in 1929 seminar. It's all correct. It's just not essential enough. It hasn't gone down into the ground. So both philosophers, when they meet in 1929, which is the basis of the so-called the Both debate dialogue, both of them are themselves in crisis. Being in Time is already finished. The Kant book has come out not as an extension and continuation of Being in Time, but as the Kant book. And of course, Heidegger himself later says, well, you know, what I say here doesn't, Kant didn't say this stuff. And Cassir's only point with the Kant book is, well, Kant didn't say this. Not that what you're saying is wrong, but Kant didn't say it. And there's a big distinction there. So we end up out of this with a duality of sense and existence, the factum and facticity of the historical world and the historicity of Dasein. And how to bring the two together is the $64 question. This is what I spent a lot of time doing. But when I moved to the Kyoto school and discovered it, I discovered something very fascinating that they had, I think, gone a long way to doing just that. So now I want to talk about Miki. I want to focus on two concepts. I think these are the core concepts for me, at least today. One is dual transcendence, and the other is historical form. So I want to explain and talk about both of those and sort of tease out some of the threads of where I think some of this stuff is coming from. So let's look at dual transcendence. The dual transcendence is essentially the twofold ladder of the imagination. It goes both up to objective forms and it goes down into the production. And so that's what allows Miki to go up and down the Hegelian ladder, if you will, that Heidegger and Cassir can't. Heidegger can't tell you what the ladder is standing on, finitude of Dasein, but he cannot say anything about where the ladder goes. Cassir can tell you where the ladder goes to a philosophy of culture. In the case of Miki, a philosophy, an anthropology, which I'm going to argue is the same thing. And Cassir cannot tell you what the ladder is standing on. Miki can go down into the ground and up the ladder at the same time because of this dual transcendence of the imagination. There is something that transcends within the human as well as without. Our actions are not determined simply by what transcends us from without, but by what transcends us from within. Okay. Nothingness is what transcends the subjective and the objective and involves them. To be determined by this nothingness is what we call pathos. The pathos lies at the base of expressive activity. There's expressive activity. All the symbolic forms are expressive. Their index of meanings are different, and how they form each other and work against each other and with each other to construct and form the world and create the world. That's another story. Every creation has the meaning of creation from nothingness, and a creation from nothingness is always determined by pathos. So let me now turn a bit to historical form. What I would argue is that Cassir cannot can explain what a form is, but not what a historical form is, and Heidegger might be able to explain what history is, but not what a form is. So neither Heidegger or Cassir can deal with historical forms in the way that Miki understands it. So it is both transcendental and concrete. It's both a factum and a facticity, sense and existence. Whatever exists has form. That is to say, it is an image of the formless. So what is a form? Well, if we go to Mickey's On the Human Condition, written in 1939, you find much of the logic of the imagination stripped of all the methodological notes, all the notes, right? A lot of the logic of the imagination is Mickey sort of presenting other people's ideas. So where's the logic that he's really trying to get to? In this text, I think you find it stripped of all that stuff. And there he clearly defines form in terms of function concepts and substance concepts, which of course now he's using explicitly the language of Kassir. A function concept is a relational concept, and Kassir develops this out of group theory. Now the difference, quick group theory 101, a set theory is basically you take any 10 objects you want in the room, we put them in a box and you got yourself a set. They have no intrinsic nature other than the fact that we just thrown them in the box. Group theory is sets, but with a determining rule that determines the relationship, possible relationships of things that could go in the box, right? So useful for running. Well, the watch can go in there, but the mask definitely not. Running with a mask, not to be done, right? So it's not very useful for running. So yeah. So each symbolic form for Kassir is a function relation. It is a particular kind of identity that attributed to altogether heterogeneous figures in virtue of their being transformable into one another by a certain operation defining a group. And this is what he calls the originary relationship. It's at the very core of everything. And that originary relationship can be understood as form, matter, existence, and meaning, I, thou, everything. So everything always has this transformative. It transforms and opens up and constitutes, it differentiates and integrates at once the possible positions. But Mickey argues that form isn't just function, it's form and substance. It has to be both. And this is where he definitely goes beyond Kassir, because Kassir pushes back the substance concepts and focuses on the function concepts. So what he does is he effectively fundamentally existentializes the function relation. But this is getting from Nakai. Nakai has already, in the late 20s, read Kassir and taken the idea of function and taken Heidegger's concept of an existentiality and put them together. And so he takes the function relation and embeds it in the existential project. Nakai's example would be a window or a ship, etc. But if we look at Nishitani, Nishitani gives an example of a T-bowl. And you can see how he talks about the T-bowl completely in terms of its functionality. It's determining how we recognize the T-bowl, as the image form of it. He also talks about the sakata, how we hear the sakata, we hear the image form of the sakata, and this is our ideas with bodies. And so what all these have in common, and this is where Kassir does, is to argue that sense and sensibility are always synthesized. There is no, you cannot have sense over here and sensibility over here. The symbol is a sensibility unity. And the different symbolic forms, whether they be language, myth, art, science, religion, myth, the difference between the sense and sensibility, there's a logic of index. So if you think about it in terms of signifier-signified relationship, the relationship between a signifier and a signified has a different index of relation in each of these symbolic forms. So in myth, the signifier is taken as the signified. There is no difference. So the sensible form of the God is the very presence of the God, or the sensible form of reality is the very presence of reality. And what's religious consciousness is going to do, and Nishitani will do this, and Miki also does this, is it takes reality, which is already an image, but not recognized as an image, and it turns and recognizes it reality as an image. But to do this, is quite the shift in the framework of the way we experience the world. So the pagans were not guilty of idolatry. They did not take an idol, an image, and worship it as a god. They worshiped the God that was right there and present in front of them, that was opening up their world. The religious move is to critique that reality and transform it into an image. And Nishitani and Miki would say that this is the only way you can have awareness from within. So, following Nakai, form is technology. So, or again, in the late 20s, well, Ernst Cassirer was the editor of the Kant edition, and so the original Kant edition is the Cassirer edition, and he also was unique in when he was doing this, in that at the time most people saw the Critique of Pure Reason as sort of the core of Kantian thought, and Cassirer was the first to say no, it is the third critique that is the core. And at the time, everyone was like, yeah, what are you talking about? And he's like, no. And one of the things he brings out is, of course, is this idea of technology of nature. And this becomes a standard starting point for Cassirians to understand how Cassirer transforms Kant into the philosophy of culture, the symbolic forms. But Nakai is studying all of this stuff and developing this idea of technology and mediation and media. So the technology is a medium and a means. And of course, all symbolic forms are going to be this type of medium and means. Language is the medium by which we think. We are always already in language, but we speak about language. And by the second we speak about language, we turn the medium into a means of expression. And that allows us to go from being constituted by language to constituting language without ever actually having to leave language. So we are able to bring language to language as language through language, and therefore transform the medium into a means of expression. So the technology is the mediation in the sense of this medium that differentiates and integrates nature and human, according to Nakai. And technology of nature, I said that. So the medium differentiates and integrates. It is a formation and configuration, a transformation that is productive. And so that this technology becomes, it's not just that it does something, but it transforms the world. So the knife actually transforms the world into something that's cuttable, and it transforms the subject into a cutter. So everything has or is form with a function. This is true for Nakai, it is true for Miki, it's true for Nishida, and it's also true for Nishiten. For Nishida, and I'll take Nakai's example, the mechanism or the medium is a transformative function, and you have, I think Nishida also gives this example, but Nakai does it. The eye is a machine, it's a mechanism, a piece of technology that transforms from one side to the other side. And this is the utsutsu that I quoted at the beginning when Nishitani is using this utsutsu. This is central to Nakai's whole sort of philosophical project, is to play on all these different levels of utsutsu, which is really annoying for a non-Japanese speaker like myself who can read but doesn't have the sound in his head, because I have to look up every single kanji to see what the phonetics is, to see if I'm getting the joke. Because once you have to do that, you kind of miss the joke. So there's their text. I translated the text by Nakai. When you have sentences that, if you were to do it phonetically, it would just be utsutsu, 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 and you're like, okay, I got it. And it's wonderful. But I think Nishida and certainly Miki have taken that up, and so does Nishitani. Miki then makes a nice, interesting move, and I think it's underestimated in the Kyoto school. And I think that other people do this, and goes to a very serious problem, or a very interesting problem. Contrary to the Greek way of thinking, the material or substantial is more primary than the tangible tangible something that has form, or the idea. This reversal, you can have this in Heidegger to a certain degree, but not really full out. And if you go back and look at the Western canon, you look at how the tradition going, this idea of a primacy of materiality is a very controversial claim. Some Aristotelian scholars say that Aristotle is committed to this idea of prima mater, but generally the argument goes, well, prima mater exists and it has form because form is the actualization of what is. And so anything that has form, right? And so you have the unmoved mover, Plotinus is the one, Christian God, the Cartesian subjects, etc. These are all spontaneous, pure acts. So everything was always pure act. And Schelling's whole philosophy suggests, and Master Eckhart suggests this idea of turning around, of putting a pure potentiality of pure matter prior to any actuality. Now, because Heidegger does this in the sense that my own most possibility of my own death is the condition of possibility, or is what conditions or constitutes or opens up my being here in the first place. It is the horizon of sense that I move towards that opens up my being in here first. So potentiality, my own possibility, comes before my actuality, is the condition of it. I think Nishida and the Kyoto school, this is what they call pure nothingness, or sunatas. These are the field of pure possibility. And it's not in the das Nichts, or the nothing, that you need to look for the Kyoto school's idea of nothingness, or this Buddha's idea of nothingness. It is in this idea of pure possibility. And there are, of course, Tibetan Buddhism, trends of Buddhism that agree with this interpretation. And I've, in a couple of texts that I published in the Nishida Society on Nishida, made this argument and showed how it would work out. Let me go back to the historical form. The historical form for Miki is also something that exists. So form is an existence form, and we have to always remember that when these thinkers are bringing in this idea of existence, they don't just mean that stable exists. The stable doesn't necessarily exist. It exists is to exist. It's to transcend it's to exist in the transcending to something else. That's what it always means to exist. It's to be in another. So in the Western tradition, something is of itself identical to itself and can be conceived only through itself. Therefore, it is completely contained. That doesn't need an other or something beyond itself to define its very being. Whereas the idea of existence is the idea that it exists only in this movement constitutive. And this becomes the hallmark of much of the Kyoto school. But certainly, Miki is saying that the historical form is a mode of existence, and therefore it has transcendence in it. In fact, something could only be if it was transcendent. Where does it transcend to? Nility. So nility is the precondition of the world to be the precondition of the human. But what is nility for Miki? It is, quote, it's the pathos dimension of nothingness. So I'll come back to that in a second.
30 minutes. Now you have 30 minutes.
Really? We're so done. Okay, in short, because of this element of transcendence, all formation is always a becoming of form. Everything is constantly in the word of becoming. The reason that's going to be, that idea is going to be important is because of time. I'm going to skip then all my quotes from Kassir about this. And I will now just focus in on the idea of mythical identity. Myth is a type of identity thinking, and it's the ground or source of culture. What myth provides is what's called an Urbild. right? An originary image that provides the presence of the Ur-Saka, where Ur-Saka means cause, but it's been hyphenated, so it's the original Saka, original thing. And that is the transcendental, transhistorical ground of history. And so the Ur-Saka is the Ur-Sak, which then forms the Urzeit of an Ur history. And so this forms the essential identity of the totem people. Nishitani gives when Nishitani explains that he uses the sun goddess and the emperor. I'll go into that. So here, the productive imagination produces a type. A symbol is a typological figure. Therefore, it is both individual and universal. Kassir makes this exact point with Heidegger and DeVos. The imagination produces the type, and that's what Heidegger he thinks is missing. Now, essentially, what I think Miki has done is he's taken the way Heidegger takes myth and uses it to get to his average everydayness. Miki has used his study of myth to get to his idea of basic experience. And the basic experience is then worked out as a lived anthropology, right? Which needs to then be self-reflectively understood through a philosophical anthropology, which would allows the philosopher to be existentially engaged in the very project of creating a culture, which I think is an important part. So this basic experience is called primary logos, but this is also what myth is called, and that's what allows me to make that extension. So now we go to the logic of making history. The mythical structure is a time of the creation of history. It is the lived existential living of history as a living in time. I'm going to have to just start going a little quicker. Therefore, just quickly going down. Therefore, mythical time manifests the historical time, the existential time that we conceive there in the fundamental connection between history and a myth. As Kassir says, it is not by its history that the mythology of a people is determined, but conversely, its history is determined by its mythology. The history of a people is determined by their system of gods. In short, what happens with Kassir, Miki, and Nishitani is that myth is the living out, the existential gazing into being in the world. That's the quote from Nishitani. Miki said more or less the same thing. And what that is that being in the world is being in time. And so it is structured by the gestalt of the image of the God. The image of the God is giving you the image of time. And so what religion does is it gives you the image of the historical ground of history. That is to say, it gives you the image of time. And depending on how that image is formed, your feeling of time and your experience of time will be very different. And so this is not a clock time. So, you know, the prophets, the whole history sense of time comes out of the future, right? Certain natural religions, it's all the cyclical. And of course, Buddhism has its own sense of time that is worked out into the notion of impermanence. And this is where Nishitani needs to then, if he wants to bring this idea of impermanence down, he needs to be able to create a sensible image of Sunata, which would always be Sunata, of course. So the Urbild is for Miki, the presence of the transcendent, transhistorical ground of history in the world. But then he says, however, the meaning of transcendence is not grasped by way of the myth. And that's where this religious critique comes out. But of course, the religious critique just turns back into myth. And that's why Kassir almost never separates the two. He always talks about the mytho-religious. And sometimes he does talk about the mythical on its own terms, and then he talks about it as magical as a technique of embodying the world, which is, if you read the Miki's chapter on technology, it's virtually all coming out of Kassir, in my opinion. And then he talks about the pure religion, and he's very careful to do when he does this. But then, of course, it's a logical absurdity. It's a logical absurdity because I start out with the real, and I make a massive leap to turn the real into a texture of the real. I turn the texture of the real into a text, into an image. And by doing so, I transform it. Nishida talks about, I'm gonna have to stop soon, so I have like 20 pages here, I think. Nishida will make a distinction between sort of being and relative nothingness and an absolute nothingness. If we can just do that quickly. And you can sort of see that initially in Nishitani, the way he sets it up between consciousness, nility, and sunnata. The difference is that Nishitani is clear that in order to get to sunnata, you need to go through nility. Whereas I think in Nishida, it's just like, let's just go to absolute nothing. Right? It's sort of, you don't have to go through it. It's not like a passageway. At least that's the impression I get. This is a distinct difference with Nishitani, that you need to go through this. Miki says, nothingness transcends the subject-object relation of the human being as a whole. It is not something that is merely internal. Rather, it transcends the dichotomy between internal and external. The consciousness of utility is the pathos of the dimension of nothingness. Nility is thus necessarily the way to reach the true state of nothingness. So you must pass through nility to get to nothingness.